Hey guys, I'm back with another marvelous video on folklore. Today we're going to dive into a legend or a myth that has been prevalent across many generations in various parts of the world. To some, it may be a fun supernatural bedtime story, a cautionary tale for kids to put them to sleep, or a fearsome creature that plagues the town at night. Without further ado, let's explore the entire life of El Cuco, a story that has equally fascinated and frightened people who have grown up hearing about it. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. What is El Cuco in folklore? What exactly is El Cuco? It's supposed to be a mythical monster or a ghost-like creature found in countries like Spain and Portugal. According to places, El Cuco, otherwise known as the Coco, Coca, Cuca, Cucuy, Cucu, Cucuy, or El Cucuy, is a counterpart to the myth of the boogeyman. Beliefs and myths around El Cuco have also reached several Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking nations. El Cuco could be seen as a bugbear in its Iberian version, and it is a figure of speech with common usage, meaning an excessive or irrational fear. The Cucuy is the masculine form, while the Cuca is a feminine form of the mythical monster. In folklore, the El Cuco is a monster that visits the house of insolent children during nighttime and kidnaps them away. El Cuco etymology across history. If I go further into the history of El Cuco, it is said that the myth of the Coco has its origins in Galicia and northern Portugal. In colloquial Spanish, the word coco means human head and also skull. It is derived from the words cocorota in Spanish and cocoruto in Portuguese, which both represent the highest place or the crown of the head. Now, tracing back to the etymology in Galicia, croca means head, which is derived from the Proto-Celtic word croca, in addition to variant croca. In Portuguese and Galician, cuca or coco is the word for head. It is akin to the Cornish word crogan, which stands for skull, and crogan arpen in Breton, also meaning skull. Clocan in Irish means skull. In many countries in Latin America, the monster is commonly referred to as El Cuco. In northern New Mexico, in areas with a sizable Hispanic population, such as southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, El Cuco is often referred to as the Coco Man in its Anglicized version. The monster is known as Cuca in Brazil and imagined as a female humanoid alligator, as it is derived from the Portuguese word for dragon, coca. Physical representations of El Cuco. El Cuco is a monster that doesn't have a general description, even as far as body or facial descriptions are concerned. However, it's said that El Cuco as a shape-shifting monster is awfully terrible to look at. The Coco in various cultures is portrayed as shapeless figures and occasionally as a hairy monster that hides under children's beds or in closets and eats children who are disobedient when they are told to go to sleep. El Cuco has various physical representations across cultures, and I'll dive into a few examples. Coca was a female dragon often celebrated in the Iberian Peninsula during the medieval era. Known as Santa Coca in Monção, Portugal, she fights against St. George in a medieval tournament during Corpus Christi celebrations. The oldest existing reference to Coca was in the year 1274 AD, from a book by King Alfonso III of Portugal, where it's referenced to as a big fish on a shore. The Cucaferra de Tortosa in Catalonia, believed to be documented in 1457 AD, is described as a zoomorphic creature that resembles a horned spined tortoise with a dragon head and claws. The Cuca in Brazil is an anthropomorphic alligator attired like a woman with a sack on her back and ugly hair. El Cuco in popular culture. There are various references to El Cuco in pop culture, so I'll talk about some of the most famous ones. In the last chapter of Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, the titular character was referred to as El Coco, or a scarecrow. Pennywise from the book It by Stephen King called himself the eater of worlds and of children, which is a common trait associated with El Cuco. The mythical monster has also appeared in television shows such as Wizards of Waverly Place, Grimm, The Outsider, and the Casagrandes. Myths and legends about El Cuco. Now things are getting more interesting, and I'm about to show you how. You see, the folklore behind El Cuco is so vast that different countries have varied myths and legends surrounding it. Let's start with Spain. Here, parents sing rhymes and lullabies about El Cuco to children to warn them that the monster will come to get them if they don't go to sleep on time. Now in Latin America, we've got El Cuco too, but their folklore is relatively different because it's usually intermingled with their native beliefs. Their folklore relates more to the boogeyman of the United States due to cultural exchanges. If we look into Mexican-American beliefs, El Cucuy is depicted as an evil monster that hides under children's beds. The monster is said to eat or kidnap the child if they disobey their parents when it's time to go to sleep at night. But the Spanish-American version of the monster, more commonly referred to as the boogeyman, doesn't look like the furry or shapeless monster of Spain. Manuel Medrano, a social science professor, claims that the popular legend narrates a small humanoid with malicious red eyes that's hidden under beds or in closets known as El Cucuy. Apparently, in the lore, El Cucuy was a kid who was a victim of violence. El Cuco in history. Throughout history, El Cuco is a mythical monster that exists as a folk tale or a bedtime story, which is often used to impose taboos and control children's behavior. If children don't obey parents' orders to sleep on time, El Cuco, being an opportunist, would hunt them down and mete out dreadful punishments, depending on whichever version of the story is told to children. El Cuco may also exist in its female form, also known as La Coca. The two creatures are somewhat the extensions of the same monster. However, La Coca is a bit more than El Cuco, taking on a female facade and vice versa, as both share the same horrendous behaviors and motives. The Outsider, El Cuco in Stephen King's novel and series. Did you know that Stephen King adapted El Cuco in one of his best-selling novels? In Stephen King's 71st novel titled The Outsider, the titular main antagonist is loosely based on the legends and folklore surrounding El Cuco. The novel was eventually adapted into an HBO miniseries of the same name, released in 2020. In King's book, The Outsider is a paranormal, shape-shifting monster that devours human beings and their suffering, and it takes on a person's external appearance by shedding its skin. After the outsider shifts, it fully transforms into the person it's imitating and obtains every part of them, like DNA and fingerprints. It can even access the memories and thoughts of the person it has taken on. However, the outsider can't be killed or injured by traditional methods like normal weapons or bullets, as it's very unaffected by bodily damage. With just a scratch, this monster can poison people and induce pain and visions in them. The outsider can sustain on negative emotions of a person, using this ability to feed on grief. Similar to Stephen King's monster, It. It's highly likely that the outsider has its origins in a similar universe as the other monsters like the Crimson King and It, as they all feed off emotions and have similar abilities. Now I'll get into the story in case you're unfamiliar, so beware of spoilers ahead. The outsider is a kind of monster that has gotten away with murdering people for many years. So one day in Dayton, Ohio, the outsider shows up at a retirement home. Once there, he extracts the blood of Heath Hodges, an orderly. As a result, the outsider shapeshifts into Heath and robs a vehicle to trap two young girls, eventually assaulting and murdering them. Gradually, he moves to his next target, a baseball coach named Terry Maitland, and steals his blood. Later, the outsider visits Heath's house, where he hides the underwear of the girls he murdered, before taking cover in a graveyard to feed on the grief of the girls' family. Eventually, the outsider escapes Dayton, Ohio in a stolen vehicle, and Heath is falsely convicted of the murder. He dies by hanging himself in prison. A few months later, the outsider finishes his transformation by shapeshifting into Terry Maitland and drives down to Flint City, Oklahoma. There, he kidnaps Frank Peterson, Terry's 11-year-old baseball student. The outsider then assaults Frank with a branch of a tree and murders him brutally, then drops Frank's body into the local park. As the investigation into Frank's murder begins, many eyewitnesses issue statements that they saw Terry with Frank before the murder and a bloodstained Terry afterwards, which leads to the real Terry's arrest before the entire town. Frank's mother also dies by a heart attack, further feeding the outsider. In the meanwhile, the outsider ends up collecting the blood of Claude Bolton, an ex-convict, and shapeshifts into a new transformation. While Terry is taken to the courthouse for his arraignment hearing, the outsider, not yet fully transformed into Claude, shows up in the crowd, rejoicing in their chaos. Lead detective Ralph Anderson and Yune Sablo, his partner, briefly spot the incomplete outsider. Ali, Frank's elder brother, pulls out a gun and shoots Terry to death to avenge his brother. Frank, and their mother. Detective Ralph shoots Ollie, and before Terry fatally succumbs to his injury, he pleads his innocence to the detective. Then the outsider visits Grace, Terry's daughter, multiple times, and torments her over her father's untimely demise. Ted, Frank's father, attempts to hang himself after having lost his whole family. As he chokes, he notices the outsider watching him. Falling unconscious, Ted is shortly found by his neighbor, who quickly cuts him down before he succumbs to death. Ted ends up in a comatose state. In a barn near Flint City, Oklahoma, the outsider's clothes are found, and Detective Jack Hoskins, who happens to be Detective Ralph's rival, is sent to investigate the area. While Detective Jack does his job, the outsider sneaks up behind him and touches his neck, and a venomous mark forms on his skin. While the outsider is in the process of transforming into Claude, he finds Detective Ralph figuring out his existence during the investigation. He acts on it quickly by using his abilities to project parts of himself in Flint City, Oklahoma, and goes on to threaten Ralph's wife and others around him to leave the case. Detective Jack meets the outsider, who knew that Jack's mother died from skin cancer. So the outsider lies to him about the venomous mark on his neck being cancer. In a bid to prevent Ralph from pursuing the case further, the outsider proposes to remove Jack's cancer on the condition that Ralph stop his investigation. The outsider then travels to Claude Bolton's mother's house in Texas, where Claude is staying. With Holly Gibney's assistance, Ralph uncovers the outsider's exact nature and Claude, his next victim. Ralph and Holly form a team of 5, along with Ralph's colleague, Eunice Sablo, Terry's lawyer, Howie Gold, and Alec Pelly, his private investigator. They travel down to Texas with the intention of protecting Claude and catch hold of the outsider before he attacks again. Detective Jack is sent by the outsider to stop them. The 5 of them stumble upon a cave pit, which happens to be the outsider's hideout spot. As they search the cave, the outsider attacks them. Jack kills Howie, Terry's lawyer, Howie and Alec, his private investigator, and attacks Yune before a rattlesnake bites Jack. To avenge his friends, Ralph kills Jack. Then he and Holly move inside the caves. While inside, they face the outsider, who now nearly transforms into Claude. He threatens that the cave will collapse on Holly and kill her if Ralph shoots him. To offer an explanation, the outsider claims that he kills only because he must in order to feed. Holly opposes his point by saying that he brutally assaulted and murdered his victims and derives sadistic pleasure from it. Thus, he is a hypocritical child predator and a serial killer. As a result, the outsider angrily launches himself at Holly, and she quickly pulls out a sock full of ball bearings to bash him to death. The outsider fragments into a horde of worms, which quickly disintegrate as well, and then Holly and Ralph escape from the cave. A couple of months later, Terry Maitland's name is pardoned in the public perception, Yune is healed from his injuries, and Detective Ralph and Holly attempt to move on from the enduring trauma of the outsider. El Cuco reimagined in cinema. Stephen King's The Outsider was adapted into a limited series of the same title. Following the same events in the book, The Outsider centers around a well-liked baseball coach named Terry Maitland, who is accused of murdering Frankie, one of the young students. Just like the twist in the book, the true killer behind the crime is the outsider, and being familiar with the El Cuco legend will help you fully understand the context. In the miniseries, Terry is played by Jason Bateman, and Frankie is played by Duncan E. Clark. Now that I've explained the whole story of The Outsider, I'll get into how it's been reinterpreted on the screen, especially the finale of the show. I found the last episode particularly shocking, as there were so many characters dying all at once. From the way Jack was positioned in the forest, looking at the road where the investigating team had stopped, to the way a brave Holly stepped out, daring Jack to kill her, the show was a roller coaster of bloodbath, suspense, and thrill. Unlike the book, certain things had been changed in the plot, like Jack getting a different ending where he shoots himself in the head when his conscience overtakes him. What really blew me away was something Holly said to Ralph towards the end of the final episode. When Ralph tells Holly that he would like to work with her again, she says, "A man knows a man," something her father, an ex-military man, often used to say. Holly also comes to another realization. An outsider knows an outsider. I think it's an interesting thing to say, as it somehow explains where the show's name came from. The quote highlights how Holly perceives herself as an outsider, due to her social awkwardness and possibility of being on the autism spectrum. Similar to El Cuco that works alone and is oblivious to whether there are others like itself out in this world, Holly has felt like an outsider. And I think the show's title relates to this idea just as well as it refers to an enigmatic monster. The overarching theme of The Outsider is pretty clear. It's about coming face to face with the unexplainable or believing in the impossible, more than chasing a supernatural monster like El Cuco. Now, how does one deal with the unbelievable? For example, Ralph wrestles with this idea for the entire show before he's simply forced to believe that the outsider exists as he faces the monster. On the other hand, Holly has faith in the evidence. However, since the rest of the world won't believe them, they find a way to shut the case without revealing to others what really went down and pardoning Terry Maitland in the process. Shape-shifting monster El Cuco versus It's Pennywise. Pennywise from It and the outsider El Cuco monsters share many things in common other than the ability to shapeshift. They have an objectively similar MO, as El Cuco's survival depends on eating and killing children, which is the case with Pennywise too. They also share a secondary trait of gaining power by feeding off of the emotions of humans. El Cuco obtains power from misery, mostly in the form of grief and loss, whereas Pennywise gains power by feeding on his victims' fear and those he terrorizes in dairy. But when it comes to shapeshifting, Pennywise's powers are more extensive, as it can take any form it wishes, while El Cuco can only scratch a person to acquire their DNA and, in a delicate process, transform into the said person over a duration of weeks. El Cuco has the power to enslave people, using them as its proxies, because it is vulnerable while finishing its most recent transformation. By scratching the back of their necks and apparently poisoning them with its own blood, El Cuco achieves this. The victims become so deliriously unwell as a result that they will finally carry out everything their new master asks of them. In a similar manner, Pennywise can hypnotize people with its deadlights, whereas El Cuco can cast illusions at people, usually to frighten them. Its power in this area is far less than Pennywise's, because these apparitions aren't physical, and El Cuco can't use them to attack or kill people, but it can use them to physically attack those it has already poisoned, like Detective Jack Hoskins. Also, when El Cuco spoke about devouring people and labeled children as tasting the sweetest, I remembered Pennywise immediately, how it sustained itself off of fear, just like how El Cuco sustained itself off of pain. Moreover, El Cuco's cave is highly similar to Pennywise's home in the sewers. And finally, when El Cuco explains the glow and lights he feels whenever he feeds on his victims, I was reminded of the 3 deadlights that Pennywise shows as he opens up its mouth. Pennywise is a little ahead of El Cuco in terms of weaknesses. A benefit El Cuco has is the ability to take victims unaffected by the power of faith or anything metaphysical for that matter. Basically, El Cuco can't be conquered by verbally bullying it, like the way it happened in the polarizing ending of It Chapter 2. However, El Cuco becomes simpler to defeat if it's caught when one is in a physical state, as is the case with Holly in The Outsider. In the novel, Holly defeats the outsider by bashing it to death with a heavy sock containing ball bearings. While it is more susceptible to being killed as a giant spider form, it's more difficult and challenging than beating it with an object. In the book, the outsider is revealed to be an accumulation of worms that can take the form of a human being. However, this ending isn't reflected in the television adaptation. While the outsider's El Cuco is undeniably less powerful than its Pennywise, I think the monster is a less evolved or younger creature of their kind. In the novel, since some of its eggs may have survived its downfall by the Losers Club, I think it's possible for the outsider's El Cuco to be its own descendant. Though there isn't a lot of info about what its initial life stage was like, the idea that El Cuco is a part of its species that hasn't completely matured yet seems frightening. And when you think about all of the boogeyman myths similar to El Cuco's story spread across various cultures, it seems creepy to think that there may be more creatures of this kind out there in several parts of the world, ready to exploit the grief and misery of humanity. And I think it's definitely possible for Pennywise and El Cuco to be related somehow, even if there's no official confirmation from Stephen King himself. It could be partially due to most of the author's stories taking place in the shared multiverse or being part of the same canon. Marvelous verdict. What do you think El Cuco is about? To many, it's the boogeyman for kids, and it's what several children who grew up hearing about myths, legends, and tales of El Cuco recall. It may have been a bedtime story used by exhausted parents to terrify their children to sleep, but anyone who is familiar with Stephen King is aware that the writer enjoys making use of folklore that is out there, or borrowing monsters from mythology. Stephen King's antagonists aren't too different from expressing themselves like the devil himself, whether they're boogeymen or vampires or any of his other villains. The influence of prevailing scary stories in King's works is strong, especially one about El Cuco for his book, The Outsider. However, The Outsider's El Cuco has its own charm, which is distinct from the popular myth. In The Outsider, the monster's true form is a body consisting of worms that can take a human being's DNA and shapeshift into them completely. And I think that's definitely more frightening than any other monster out there. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe, and thanks everyone.